Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in web development. In today's lesson, we are going to have a brief discussion about PHP variable scope. Now today's lesson is going to be quite short, but variable scope is very important as part of the PHP programming language ecosystem. Now let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Now, in today's lesson, we are going to cover the following topics. First, we'll explore the PHP variable scope in a bit of detail. Then we'll move on to understanding local, global, and static scope variables to distinguish the differences between how they work. And then lastly, we'll have a practical demonstration, as always, where I'll show you how we can work with local, global, and static scope variables. Wonderful. Now let's dive right into our very first topic and let's have a look at PHP variable scope in a bit of detail. Now, what exactly is PHP variable scope? Well, by definition in PHP, variables can be declared anywhere within the script, whether it be within a function or in the broader global scope of our document. The scope of a variable is the part of the script where the variable can be referenced or accessed or even used. Now, when it comes to variable scope in PHP, we have three different types. We have global scope variables, we have local scope variables, and we also have static scope variables. Let's dig a little deeper to see how they differ. Now, when it comes to global scope variables, it can be accessed in any part of the script or the program. However, in order to be modified, a global variable must explicitly be declared to be global in the function in which it is to be modified. And I'll show you an example of this in a second. This is accomplished conveniently enough by placing the keyword global in front of the variable that should be recognized as a global variable. Now, here is a quick example of how all of this works together. So here we've got our script and then we've also got our output. Now you'll notice in my script, I have this variable called my global var. This is a variable that I created and I assigned it a value of 9. Now, following this within a function that I've created, and don't worry too much about functions right now, this is something we'll get to at a later stage. But within this function, I'm calling this keyword global and then I'm calling this variable again. Why? Because I want this function to recognize the variable that I'm using here is a global variable. And essentially all I'm doing here is just incrementing this value. So you'll see the following line is my global var ++, which just increments the value of the global scope variable, which is 9. And you'll see in our output, we actually get 10. So this works just fine. So this brings us to our local scope variables. And this is a variable declared inside a function. And this is considered local. That is, it can be referenced solely within the function that it is being created in. Any assignment outside of that function will be considered to be an entirely different variable from one contained in the function. Okay, so here is another example, and this is what our output looks like. Now, let's just go over this code briefly. You'll notice that I have this thing called a local variable that I specified inside of my function called assign x. So I've got this variable x which equals 150, but this has been created inside of the function that I created. Then I have another variable called x which is equal to 10. Now, if we have a look at this code, in my function, all I'm doing is I'm saying echo x inside function concatenated with x. Concatenation is something we'll cover in a second. So I'm assigning this variable with a string, okay, inside my function that is. So inside my function, what I should expect to get is x inside function is equal to 150, and we can see that's valid and true based on our output. Now with the second part, after calling the function assign x, you'll notice I have another echo statement that says x outside of function is x again, but the value here is different. The value here is actually 10. The point that I'm trying to make here is that a local scope variable can only be accessed and modified within the function that it is being created. If there is a global variable with the same name that exists outside of that function, then that is considered a completely different variable. Awesome. Now, I know that can be a mouthful, but when we do the practical demonstration, all of this is going to make sense because we'll code along together. And this brings us to the last of the three scopes, and that is static scope variables. Now, in contrast to the variables declared as function parameters, otherwise known as inputs to a function, which are destroyed on the function exit, A static variable will not lose its value when the function exits and will still hold the value should the function be called again. So the best way to think of a static scope variable is that it holds its value regardless of the function being destroyed or exited. But when we do our demonstration, this is all going to make sense. You can declare a variable to be static simply by placing the keyword static in front of the variable name. And here is an example of what that looks like with our output. Now let's take a second to work through this together. In this example, I've got this function called keepTrack, and inside of this function, I've created a variable called number with a value of 0 assigned to it. Now, in front of this variable, I have this keyword static. This is just to denote that this is a static scoped variable. Then I've got another variable called text. Now, in front of this variable, I have the keyword global. You will see at line 9 of this example, there is a variable that exists outside of this function, also called text, and the value assigned to it is function call. Okay, so all I'm doing here is I'm noting that this is a global variable that I'm working with, and then I simply just increment the number that is at line 16. After this, we then echo text concatenated with number, and then we simply just add a break for a separate line. Now, this is where the magic really happens, because here I'm calling the function 3 times, but that variable, the variable called number, which is static, never gets destroyed. Instead, it just updates and updates and updates, regardless of whether the function was exited or not. And we can see this when we call keepTrack 3 times, we actually get function call 1, function call 2, as well as function call 3. Now, you may have seen concatenation in action with a couple of the examples that we've already covered, but this one is very easy to understand. In PHP, the concatenation operator is essentially just a full stop, and this is used to combine 2 values. So we could combine 2 strings or 2 integers, or a string and an integer if we wanted to, and this is an example of what that would look like. So here I've got a echo statement, and I'm concatenating IAMString1, and you'll notice that my full stop is outside of my quotation marks. Okay, that's very, very important to keep in mind. And then I'm opening a new string and I'm saying, and IAMString2, and then I'm closing that off. And this is how concatenation works inside of PHP. Wonderful. And now it's time for that part of the lesson that I know most of you are looking forward to, and that is our practical demonstration. So without further ado, let's dive right in and let's code. Now, in this practical demonstration, we are going to go over the various scopes when it comes to our variables, and we'll also mix in a bit of HTML because I do think it's about time for that. So the first thing we'll actually do is just create a new document over here. So I've got my Atom open. Also, do keep in mind that it's very, very important that you have your Apache server up and running. So always ensure that you click start and that you have both your Apache server and your SQL database in the green status. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file. And I'm going to store this file in my XAMPP folder, htdocs. I'm going to call this one L3. And this just denotes that this is lesson 3. Okay, so PHP. And then I'll save this. Now I'm going to run my auto-completion by typing in HTML. And it's going to give me this over here, this boilerplate over here. And I'm going to just name the title over here, PHP variable scope. Now, one thing to note is that even though this is an HTML file, in a sense, we still store it and save it as a PHP document because we are going to embed PHP code inside of this. Okay, so very, very important. Do not save this as an HTML document. This must be saved as a PHP file. Great. And then I'm going to come down to the body over here, and I'm just going to add in a header of size 1, and I'm going to actually just copy and paste all of this. And there we go. So I can actually go and run this to see if it's working. So I'll say local host, and I'm looking for L3 PHP. Wonderful. And my document seems to be working just fine. So let's head back over to Atom. And I'm going to start playing around with my variable scopes. What I'll also do is just include my PHP tags, opening and closing tag over here. And I'm going to start off with my global variables. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable called global. And this is equal to I am a global variable. So just a very, very simple string. Right, now I know if I'm going to echo this, it's going to work just fine. It's actually going to print to the screen and we can test for that. So I'll say echo $global. I'll save this. Also ensure that I have my semicolon over here. And if I refresh, everything works just fine. But now, what if I wanted to actually use a function? How would this alter all of this? So I'm going to delete this echo statement. And I know we haven't covered functions yet, but if you remember from our JavaScript tutorials, functions are pretty much very much the same when it comes to working in PHP. But we will have a lesson on PHP functions at a later stage. So I'm going to call this function print text. This one does not take in any parameters, and this is what needs to happen. This is essentially the function body, if you will, or the expression that needs to run within this function. So now I'll say something like echo global, and then I'll close this off. And then of course I need to call this function. So I'll say print text. I'll save this up. And if I run this now, I'm getting this undefined variable error. And the reason for this is when running a function and when including any data in the function, like this variable, calling this variable over here, PHP is first going to look inside of its local scope and see if it exists, because it's not going to just assume that it's a global scope. What I could do to alter this is I could just add the keyword global. And then I'll add the $ again. I'll say global. Case sensitivity is an issue, so we need to make sure we spell this correctly. And essentially what's happening now is this function is now going to go and look for a global variable called global outside of the function body. And we have that over here. Okay, so if I save this and I run this now, everything works just fine. So that's global variables. What about local variables and how do we work with these? So I'm going to create, just comment this out for the time being. I'm going to create a variable called local. And this is going to be equal to I am a local variable. Great. And I'm going to change this over here to local as well. And then I'll save this. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create another local variable. And bear with me for a second because I will explain what's going on over here. So local, and I'm going to set this equal to I am actually global. So what's happening over here? Well, first of all, we've created a local variable called local inside of our function, and we've created another one outside of the function. So this is actually globally scoped and not locally scoped. Locally scoped variables are variables that exist within a function, for example. So if I save this and I refresh, I'm getting I am a local variable. And if I had to comment this out, it's going to throw that undefined variable once again. Okay, so that's basically how we can work with the various scopes. Now, what about static? I'm actually going to clean all of this up and I'm going to demonstrate to you how static works. So just get this right. Now, I'm simply going to increment a number because I feel that's going to be one of the easiest examples. So I'm going to create a function over here. And this function is just going to be called track number. Does not take in any parameters, and this is the function body. Let's just give this a bit of space. Now, I'm going to say number is the variable, and this is equal to 0. Now, what I want to happen is I want to increment this number, and that should work just fine. But there's an issue here. So, add. So this is how we increment numbers in PHP. Okay. And then I'm simply just going to echo number dot break tag. So this is just going to add the number on a different line, on a new line, if you will. So I'll say break, save this, and now I'm going to call my function track number. Just make sure we've cleaned everything up nicely. Great, everything seems to be working just fine. So now if I hit back over and I refresh, I get 1, which is exactly what should happen because we only incremented once. But what happens if I wanted to increment twice? I'll save that. I'm still getting 1. And I can do this several times. I could even add another one over here. This is simply not going to change. The state will always be 1. So what's happening here? Now, when it comes to functions in any programming language, after the function has essentially run, the variables that are inside gets destroyed. So every time I call this function, it's going to be a new iteration of that function. So it never stores number as a value that you can use over and over and over again. So how do we get around this? We simply add the static keyword. And now when I run this, I should get 1, 2, and 3. So let's see this in action. And there we go. I have 1, 2, and 3. Let's actually copy and paste this. Save it up. Refresh. 1, 2, 3 up until 6. So what's happening here? The static keyword over here, because we've made this variable static, we are able to keep track of its value throughout this function. Even if the function gets destroyed, that value is still stored for later use. And this is quite important and very, very useful in PHP if you need to maintain a piece of data or a value in a certain state for a long period of time. And that is basically it for today's lesson. In our next lesson, we're going to have a look at the various data types that we can work with in PHP. It might be slightly more complex, but it's not going to be all that difficult. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.